Why don't we respond to homelessness like we do natural disasters? Is it because the life of a person that is homeless is deemed to be worth less than a house person that lost their housing because of a hurricane or a fire or tornado? Or here's what I think. Society thinks people that are homeless for reasons other than a natural disaster must have brought it on themselves. And the people that became homeless through a natural disaster became homeless through no fault of their own. This latter group are seen as worthy of incredible government investment to rebuild and recover. The first group, they get scraps in a grossly underfunded sector that is perpetually asked to do more with less. That's the reality. Also, the reality is that society does not give two craps about people who are homeless. Do you know how many complaints elected officials and police get every single day about the fact that there are people who are homeless? These are not calls for concern. These are not all calls about behaviors that are deemed as dangerous or illegal. These are calls to get rid of human beings because they are seen as unsightly. Their crime? Existing. Empathy is increasingly rare. Sympathy is almost non-existent. But instead of being mad enough to demand a different response akin to what would roll out if there was a natural disaster, the vast majority of the general public just want people who are homeless to be out of sight. Homelessness, like populations impacted by a natural disaster, are experiencing a housing problem. People may have co-occurring support needs, but it is still a housing problem. This isn't an opinion, it's a fact. Study after study shows that when there's insufficient housing that people can afford, that homelessness goes up. Go ahead and look at research done by the likes of the Pew Charitable Trusts or the US Government Accountability Office that demonstrates a 100% increase in median rent increases homelessness 9%. Or read the book Homelessness is a Housing Problem, which found that even when controlling for variables like substance use, climate, and mental health, that insufficient housing that is affordable is the greatest predictor of the rates of homelessness. The problem with our general perception of homelessness, as it is commonly viewed when compared to a natural disaster, is a causal fallacy. You see this in media all the time. See, with a natural disaster, it's easy to point to what caused the homelessness. The flood or the fire or the tornado, for example. But with other forms of homelessness, what are symptoms or characteristics of homelessness are seen as the causes of the homelessness. Take substance use, for example. Yes, rates of substance use are higher amongst the chronically homeless population. But as I outlined in my book, the book on ending homelessness, most people with a substance use disorder are housed, not homeless. Or look at data on rates of substance use as provided by the likes of the US Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Because it bears this out, rates of people living with addiction in a state are much higher than the volume of people experiencing homelessness in that same state. Substance use gets worse with homelessness. Or take poverty. Again, as I explain in my book, people who are homeless are economically poor in almost all instances, but almost no poor people become homeless. Tonight in America, there will be at least 700,000 people experiencing homelessness that can be located and counted. Even if that were to be a huge undercount, it would still come nowhere close to the tens of millions of people who are housed and economically poor. Same could be done with mental illness. I could prove to you that there's more people living with mental illness who are housed than there are who are homeless. But this line of thinking about homelessness compared to natural disasters reinforces a heuristic fallacy, which is to believe from a small sample biases and media representation that all people who are homeless must have those conditions. Think of these things the next time someone says they don't want people who use drugs or people with mental illness in their neighborhood. Or government announces that they're going in the direction of treatment and recovery directed services for their homelessness response. And even within the homelessness sector, Consider how many times you see the idea reinforced that some people are deserving of housing and others are deemed not ready. Or after a natural disaster, ask why people who are already homeless in the community at the time of the disaster are often not allowed to use the same shelters as others impacted by the natural disaster. And because we can't wrap our heads around logic versus our false perceptions, even in the face of data to the contrary, we don't treat homelessness as it is most often experienced with loss of housing caused by a natural disaster. If we did, you'd expect greater investment and mobilization from governments. You'd expect more temporary housing and accelerated construction of government-assisted housing. But because we don't, we're left fighting for scraps and trickles of people that are moving into housing. We can do better. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing.